Where else do you start today except for one of the most electric guards in the NBA? Huge night for him, and that's Markelle Fultz returning to the Orlando Magic the first time over a year. We will ask Rudy about that maybe some other time this week. Now, we have to start with Ja Morant, who has now become appointment viewing. And it's awesome to see this. It's awesome to see it play out nationally where somebody that I think all of us just enjoy so much. He goes for 52 last night against the Spurs. A career high for him. First ever 50-point game in Memphis history. That's after he set his own career high this past weekend against the Bulls with 46. So he's on an absolute tear. Last night's game, he had 13 straight in the fourth quarter, and it was actually still kind of a game with San Antonio. I don't think he missed a shot in the fourth quarter on top of everything else. He hit a bunch of threes. He had a dunk on Jakob Poeltl where people were afraid Poeltl was going to retire after the fact. And by the way, Poeltl's not terrible. It was one of those vicious jaw dunks where there's another level that he gets to. I don't know how many of you remember the Tom Chambers dunk over Mark Jackson. It was basically the dunk for not only that season, but also the video game, because they basically were like, there was this move you could play in the game where if you took off with Tom Chambers, you would just go up higher than everybody else, which seems a little ridiculous because Jordan was playing at the time too. And the reason he went up so high on that is because Mark Jackson helped kind of lift him up beyond what a guy would normally do, any human would do. And Ja has more moments right now that don't seem human than maybe anybody in the league. And I don't know. I don't know who keeps track of the non-human movements, but that's what we have with Ja. His attacking is relentless. I don't think anybody splits a double team better than he does. You think you have him just walled off. You think that there's no way he can get through, and then he gets through you. You think that he's done on his drive and the angle is cut off and he's going to have to turn and kick it back out to somebody else. Then he takes kind of this Euro Ginobili step and then gets the ball up and around and flips it from a different angle that you weren't expecting. And it happens all the time. And he plays with this viciousness too, which I love because we want all of our stars to have confidence, right? We want them to have a little bit of attitude, maybe a lot of attitude, but we don't want so much confidence and so much attitude that it detracts from the actual game and in those winning moments. And he appears to have the perfect combination of all these elements that you want in the personality of a superstar. Very early in the season, when they started putting this together and going on a roll and you started to see this big statistical jump from Ja, I mean, here's just one example. PER isn't always the best, but it's really telling for perimeter players. His PER has jumped from like, hey, it's pretty good as Ja, like mid-teens, 16, 17. To 25. It's jumped like 10 points, 8 or 9, 10 points, depending on how you track the last 2 years. But there also was a joy that this team had where not only did they feel connected, which is very important in basketball. I use it when I'm super complimentary of basketball teams. They're connected. They know everybody's role. Everybody seems to be kind of happy in their role. And this is a Memphis team that's deep too and has a lot of pieces, but there's a joy and attitude that they have whether it was talking shit to LeBron James, just saying, hey, we're not afraid of you anymore, going into New York City and being like, whatever. Like, this is, you guys want to mess with us? Go ahead, because we think we're that good. And they're knocking on some doors here. Now, when the MVP race comes through, Ja's going to now having guys like me, or some that are still on television, going to be saying Ja's the clear MVP. And what's the rule we hate more than anything else is that when somebody makes these arguments, it says it's not even close. The whole point of this MVP race this season, as I've said numerous times, is that it is actually really close. But it's not to be dismissive of Ja. It's just that he's the next guy up for that. It now becomes the unanimous dude. And there is something to be said of having popular opinion, and certainly the people on television that have MVP votes. It's almost sometimes where people like kind of the mob mentality could kind of shift in a certain direction. So to have that momentum is actually important for you potentially winning an MVP. But if we look over the timeline, Durant had a stretch, Steph had a stretch, Jokic just had a stretch where he's still very much in this thing. Embiid then kind of took over for Jokic where it felt like it was the two of them. Embiid is still very much in it as well. And then DeRozan was the most recent guy, in just the last week plus, a little bit before the All-Star break, a little bit after it, where it's like, now DeRozan's actually the guy now. And maybe he is, and maybe he gets votes, but if you were going to look at some of the Ja stuff, you could say, well, he's missed 14 games, but he's played more games than Embiid. He's going to play more games than Durant. I think Steph's kind of out of the conversation at this point. Giannis gets criminally overlooked, even though his numbers are basically identical to what he's done in previous years, and he's going to have a career high in win shares and PER. And by the way, Giannis is also hitting his free throws again. So I think Ja is in this conversation, but when you can look at some of the standing stuff, you're like, well, what if Chicago's a 1 seed? It's DeRozan. Well, Memphis has a better record right now than Philadelphia and Chicago, which is my point of really saying have an open mind about all of this stuff. Because as somebody that did do this for a long time and knows what it's like to sit in those pre-show meetings and know that the sexiness that next morning, be like, hey, what do you want to say about Ja? And you're like, well, this is where I always sucked at it. And I'd go, he's in the MVP conversation. I think Memphis is really good. And I fucking love Ja Morant. What do you want me to say? It's like, well, could you say he's definitely the MVP? And I'd be like, well, no, I don't really believe that. Like, we still have ways to go here. We got like 20 games. Do you want to say Memphis is going to win the title? No, I don't. I'm not going to say they're incapable, but that would seem really dismissive of maybe the deepest top of contenders we've had in a really long time. Okay, do you want to say that Ja's maybe better than any other point guard? No. I mean, he might be, but I still think I'm probably going to take Steph. All right, would you say that you would take Ja to start your team over anyone else right now? I don't know that I would do that either. I really like him. I think it's clear the first 5 minutes of this monologue, I really like him, but I don't know that I would do those things. And the thing is none of that shit really matters. It's sexy. It gets the attention the next day. Everybody's in a hurry to kind of do some of these things, but none of that stuff really matters. And I'm going to make a point here. When I've talked college football over the years, I probably seem more forgiving for certain programs and certain coaches than others would, because my grade or my gauge of who you are as a program and as coach is, are you in the mix to play in a conference championship? And does that mean that you're in the mix then to be in the playoff? And that means if you're sort of flirting with that playoff mix and maybe not even get in or win your conference championship, if you're one of those programs that feels like they're flirting with it for about 10 weeks of the season, then that's really the best that you can do, unless you have the standard of, say, an Alabama or Clemson or maybe even now Georgia. But Georgia's a good example because Georgia plays in a national championship, loses an epic game to Tua. They're hanging around, but they still got Bama in the way. But I'm looking at it going, how are you guys knocking this program? Like, they're right there talent-wise. And I know people didn't like Kirby until he won a national championship, or at least they were frustrated by him until he won it. But I'm thinking this is all you can really ask for. They are in the mix, and this is very real. This is a real thing. It's not the flashy things. This is real, and this matters. And it might work out for them. It might not. But the fact that they're in this group of teams is really what you're hoping to do when you're building a program. And that's what's important, the real stuff. Memphis has a real guy. I don't know how long that list is. I usually would argue that it's like 6 or 7 players that can absolutely change the course of your franchise. That list is rarely 10 players long. I think it's usually a lot shorter than that, but we'll flirt with different things. But even if you look at the timeline of, say, a Trae Young, Trae Young comes in, okay, is it going to be good? Is it going to be a disaster? It was way too negative for him early on. Remember the summer league and all that kind of stuff. And then you could see how talented he is. Like, okay, he's scoring. But then last year it felt real because they beat the Sixers. They play in the Eastern Conference Finals. And now you're starting to feel like if you're a Hawks fan, you have something to build on. Same thing happened with Giannis. Giannis took a little while. And it was like, okay, there's some exciting plays and some cool videos that break out, but how good of a basketball player is he? And then he transitions into, holy shit, I think we really have something here. In Milwaukee, despite their frustrations and the playoff exits, certainly the one against Miami a couple of years ago, you at least had a building block, somebody that changes who you are as a franchise, the culture, all these things that we could throw around a lot. But you know what? Like, culture is actually important. It's just that people pretend that they can just invent it out of thin air. So whatever the sexy things that you hear about Ja that you're going to hear, like, you're going to hear a ton of it. And he deserves all of those things. But the way I would look at it is saying Memphis is real. They have one of these franchise-changing players. And honestly, that's way more important than some of the sexy headlines where I think it'd be really aggressive statements about Ja. And as sexy as those all may be, they're not nearly as important as now looking at Memphis as a real team, a team you have to take serious in the playoffs, a player like Ja that can close out maybe anybody with his offensive attacking style, a deep team that seems to love playing with each other. And it really feels like a team that, I'm always a little cautious about young teams in the playoff. The history there isn't great, but it may feel like they've jumped the line here a little bit. And that very well could be the case with whatever happens with Phoenix. If Golden State doesn't have enough size, if Draymond doesn't come back and look as good as he did the first half of the season, considering all the games he's missed, all the East teams that I keep changing my mind about and not wanting to give up on some and completely dismissing others. The most important part of the Memphis conversation is that they're real. They need to be taken that way, even though that's not as much fun as some of the other things you're going to hear this week.